Hi geography students, this is Mrs. Wiley. This is our video lecture over language, chapter 6. Of course, as always, have some notes or your study guide out so that you can jot down questions you might have to ask in class or to answer the questions in preparation for the test. Language is a vital part of our culture, and so it deserves its own chapter. Another main point is that the AP Human Geography exam, a large chunk of the exam will come from Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, so we do need to make sure we feel very comfortable with this information. The first main question we're going to break the chapter up into is just what is language and why is it important to culture? So, of course, a language is a set of sounds, combination of sounds, symbols. It is certainly a way that we identify ourselves. If you remember from Chapter 5, we identify ourselves by things like our race and our ethnicity, our gender, and we also do it by our culture, language being one of those things that is a part of culture. It also shows up on the landscape in terms of signage. Of course, you hear it when you walk down the street. And you can also tell a whole lot about differences between languages when you look at the landscape around where a culture is. They discuss the differences within Belgium in terms of its languages. That's sort of the field note, which I'll talk about in just a second. But the other thing that's discussed in this section is the idea that when one culture comes in and forces their language on another, the original group, the natives, often lose their language, their original language, and that helps them, or hurts them, I should say, from knowing how to identify themselves. So this is a quote about when the Americans forced English on the Native Americans and how they felt invisible as a result of it, because they had lost a part of who they are and how they identify themselves. So please kind of keep that in mind in terms of language being a part of how we identify ourselves and the effects of different languages on each other. One way we see language on the landscape is certainly, as I said earlier, in signs. And this is a picture in Quebec in Canada, where you'll notice the signs are in French, not English. And we watched a video about Montreal and how they have instituted laws to try and keep their language intact. So they make the public schools, the free public schools in French, and they pay immigrants to learn English. No, sorry, not English, French. And they, again, put the signs in French to try and keep that alive and keep that culture trait from dying. They also have voted in the past there was a referendum to secede from Canada so that they could have their own country that would just be a French-speaking country. That didn't pass for different reasons, one being that the Native Americans that live in Quebec do not want to be a French state or be separate from the rest of Canada. But also you have the English speakers and immigrants who oftentimes feel that English is the preferred language and so did not want to lose the allegiance or alliance with the rest of Canada. So for now, there is one country above us, but in the future there may be two if Quebec actually votes to secede. The other mention they do in terms of keeping language alive and intact is the Académie Française, who makes languages standard and makes sure that the French language is preserved so that new words that come up, especially with our modern technology, they make sure that there is a French word for that so that it doesn't get lost and only become more English. The other thing I like about this particular slide is the map of Europe, and it shows you how many different language subfamilies and families are found in Europe. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, so I won't go too much. Just be aware of this map and kind of understand which language families are in Europe, as well as what subfamilies are within those languages or language families. We discussed the fact that in Britain they have different policies, not necessarily policies, but in terms of keeping the language, the King's English versus other dialects of British English. And also I would argue that we discuss this in terms of dialects within the United States too, and what we think of as the quote unquote American English will be different in different regions, and what you prefer or what you think of as being the appropriate way of saying American English is different in different areas. Same thing in Britain with British English. This is the field note about Belgium. So Belgium has two main regions, Flanders and Wallonia. In Flanders they speak Flemish, and in Wallonia they speak French. And they actually couldn't agree on how to conduct business. The government basically shut down for a little while because they couldn't agree on which language to make laws in. That is still an issue. The reason why they haven't split as a country is because of Brussels. So Brussels is not only the capital of Belgium, but it's also one of the capitals of the European Union. And neither Flanders or Wallonia want Brussels to leave, or the European Union to leave, and so they have remained intact as one country of Belgium, but you again may see in the future a division as a result of language. This is a map of the United States with percentages of people who speak a language other than English at home. Remember, the two states that are considered bilingual in the United States are New Mexico and Hawaii. And those are different languages that are spoken there. But of course, the idea that why we would have so many different languages being spoken in those states certainly has a role to play in terms of migration and immigrants that have come into the country. But I do want to remind you that it's not only people from Central and South America that have come in. Of course, Spanish is our number one secondary language after English, but we also have a lot of Chinese speakers, Korean speakers, and you see the other languages that are spoken here. In terms of the American English, this is kind of what I was talking about, referring to earlier. Dialects are regional variations of language. They're not different languages, so please remember that. Dialect is just a regional variation. The things that are different are going to be, some of the vocab will be different, the words will be different for things. Remember, we talked about the idea of Coke versus pop versus soda, or in terms of the what we in the South call the sub sandwich. In other places in the country, you will hear things like hoagie or hero or po' boy. Those are all the same type of idea, but the word for it is different based on the region. Spelling also can change in terms of dialect. Pronunciation will be different. Think about the British English and the American English, with aluminium and aluminum, or laboratory and laboratory. Cadence has to do with the speed that we say the words or the sentences, and then pace of speech also has to do with sort of how you enunciate certain things. In terms of the word isogloss, the vocab word isogloss, this has to do with the geographic boundary between two dialects. So for example, on the map that you see here, Oklahoma is an isogloss between the states that say pop and the states that say Coke. So it is a border between those two dialects. And so people in Oklahoma will say both of those things depending on where you are, because they have had an influx of people who say pop, and they've had an influx of people who have said Coke, and so they are a mixture of the two. Same thing with like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. Actually, no, not Wisconsin, I'm sorry. New Mexico, sorry. Last thing in terms of this particular section is the idea of, again, a vocab term, mutual intelligibility. This is when two people can understand each other when speaking. They are speaking two different languages, but the languages obviously come from the same place, so that the differences there exist, but for the most part they can make do understanding each other and can understand each other. I would say that probably Spanish and Portuguese are a very good example of this mutual intelligibility. However, some people refer to the Chinese language, which isn't exactly correct because there are two main languages within China, Mandarin and Cantonese. These people that speak Mandarin do not understand people that speak Cantonese. That is not mutually intelligible. So what this really brings up is that it's very difficult to come up with an actual number of how many languages there are in the world. Because if you say Chinese as a language, but if you mention Mandarin and Cantonese, those are not mutually intelligible. Those would be two separate languages. And we tend to think of Spanish and Portuguese as two separate languages. However, they are able to understand each other. So it's a fuzzy line in terms of how many languages there are in the world. But you do definitely have to understand that if two languages cannot understand each other, they are not mutually intelligible. Those are two separate languages. So next section will be about how languages are distributed and also diffused. So this is a great map to refer to before the test. This is the world language families. So the most widespread language family in the world, or the one that is found in most areas, is the Indo-European language family. Sometimes I like to call that PIE, Proto-Indo-European. It's just easier to say. And one of the main reasons, and we'll discuss this in just a second, that Indo-European is so widespread around the world is because of colonization. So you'll notice, of course, in North America and South America, but also in Europe, parts of Russia, South Asia, and even the Middle East, Australia because of colonization. It's really around the world. So that's the one that stands out as the most. So kind of remember that. But I also want you to know what language families dominate in other areas. So if I asked you for like what language family dominates in China and Southeast Asia, you would say the Sino-Tibetan. If I ask you for Africa, that's a little more tricky. However, the orange is more dominant, which is the Niger-Congo. So you have to remember that although Africa is very fragmented in terms of its language families, the one that dominates is Niger-Congo. The one that dominates in North Africa and the Middle East is the Afroasiatic. So keeping in mind where these language families are more dominant is important for this map, but also understanding that within these language families you have subfamilies and you have individual languages. So for example, if we look at Indo-European in Europe, a language subfamily of Indo-European is the Romance languages. Those are the ones that are Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. And those, of course, are the individual languages found within the subfamily. So just kind of keep those in mind. So languages are formed from looking, and we look at and find out where languages are formed from looking at the cognates. And the cognates are the root of the word, and we can see different words have the same root, or the different languages have the same roots. So for example, the idea of milk. So in Latin, it's latte, lata in Italian, leche in Spanish, and lait in French. So you can hear that there's a common root to it. And so we know that Italian, Spanish, and French came from Latin as a result. William Jones is the one that studied Sanskrit, and he is the one that's connected it with Greek, which is part of the Indo-European family. So Sanskrit is part of the Indo-European family as well, and is also why Hindi is, because Hindi comes from Sanskrit. Languages form in two main ways. It's not the only ways, but these are the two main ways. So there's language divergence, where you have one language, and as the speakers of the language migrate into different areas, they usually speak different dialects, which then over a long period of time and having that distance between them becomes two separate languages. The other thing that might happen is language convergence, which is, again, two into one. So when you have two languages where you have people who speak them differently, two different languages, come together in one place, they tend to share words from the two languages together, and it becomes one language. This is how English happened, as Anglo-Saxon German and French Latin met up. And then backward reconstruction is the idea of taking it back as far as you can and looking at all of the same roots and different words and trying to figure out where everything came back from, the original language. Jacob Grimm is the one that decided in terms of looking at Vater and how we've softened the consonant to a Vater and then a father over time, and so that's how we can go back and figure out where language comes from. I'm going to stop here. There'll be a part 2 video in just a second.